Welcome to the Daily Agenda. Very interesting subject is the Epping protests. People seem to think that police collusion with the far left is something recent, i.e. only just happened at Epping when they walked them on into the demonstration and then bussed them out in their vans and then denied it, obviously. I mean, it's just absolutely blatant what happened. And even more blatant, the Chief Constable's lies about it. Well, nobody should surprise by that, surely. Are you surprised? You must have been living on another planet if you're surprised by what happened. But in truth, collusion of a political nature has been going on for decades, hasn't it? Certainly has in my experience, and I'm very experienced, very, very experienced. And so let's not just make this all about right-wing groups, so-called, and let's also cover the issues regarding the left. I mean, the miners' strike, 1984, and the strikes before that, but particularly 1984, saw an utterly overt collusion between the Tories and the police. In fact, the police simply became a branch of the Tory party, in truth, didn't they? Certainly my experience of it. This is my vivid, detailed recollection of it. And including soldiers dressed up in police uniforms sent in to beat up miners in Yorkshire. All documented fact. And it's not opinion. We don't need to rely on opinion. So what are we actually talking about here? You know, I mean, policing is a protection racket. And taxes paid into it are just like paying the mob for protection, as you'd see in any old gangster film, quite frankly. I would say, though, that the criminal underworld, in many cases, are a damn sight more efficient at public protection than this left-wing police force today. But they weren't left-wing under Thatcher. On the contrary, the common purpose fanatics hadn't yet got their tentacles into the coppers. But I remember the miners' strike, and the police were overtly Tory. Absolutely. In fact, I remember applying to join the army shortly after the miners' strike, and the recruiting sergeant there in Nottingham at the Army Careers Office sang the praises of the Tories. Oh, we've always had a pay rise every year under the Tories, and he basically expected all new recruits to vote the Tories when they were able to do so. Yeah, so yeah, overt politicisation in both the police and the military, in my experience. And so the miners' strike in itself was a despicable ordeal. Admittedly, you know, my own father, who was a miner and an NUM liaison officer, didn't support Arthur Skolguls because he didn't hold a ballot. And that was the main bone of contention. And my father had actually retired then on the grounds of ill health, pneumoconiosis. And so he wasn't able to play any role in the strike. But I remember discussing it with him, and he said, you know, under no circumstances should Skolguls have gone into a strike of that nature, because one, he didn't have a ballot of the membership, and two, the coal yards were full and operating to capacity, and so therefore holding the government to ransom strategically was almost impossible. And so that was the mistake that was made. And of course, Skolguls made many other strategic mistakes, like the loss of the Battle of Orgreave, which should have been won quite easily. Very easily. Anyone who studied that battleground would know that the mounted horse could have been shredded very easily, with thousands of projectiles on the high ground held by the miners. But of course, Skolguls, you know, either too gutless or too clueless to use the environment to his advantage and win that battle. But the Battle of Orgreave, yeah, I mean, the violence meted out there. I mean, that was all in league with the Tories. It was to prop up a Tory regime. And whilst people will say, oh, well, they had a majority at the election. Well, yes, I suppose they did, but the vast majority of the people in the country didn't vote for them, didn't they? Isn't that the beauty of first past the post, the elective dictatorship system that we have? You know, it's never truly representative or democratic, is it? It's just first past the post. And because we don't have proportional representation, we don't have true democratic representation in Parliament. So that in itself is a very valuable point to make. In fact, to reiterate it, because I think that point's been made many times before, and quite rightly so. But the overt politicisation there, I mean, I remember talking to a member of the Labour Party who was a friend of my father, and she explained how Special Branch used to harass them. And even on a party line, they were intercepting the call between Labour activists and the miners, and plotting, obviously, their wicked schemes, so to speak. Well, quite literally, actually, not just so to speak. And yes, I remember all of that in great detail. In fact, I remember all the strikes in the 1970s when my father was an NUM liaison officer. And shortly before he died, I discussed it with him. And I said to him, you know, those incidents of intimidation and harassment at home when we were children, was that done by the Special Branch? And he said he believed that it was done by a Special Branch because all of the miners were being targeted in that way. In fact, there was one particular night I remember. I was about 4 years old, so it'd been around about 1972, 73, and my father was involved in organising industrial action, as it was called, and someone came round, and we had double doors on the front, glazed door and a door on the side. And the doors on the front, the two doors, were actually painted green, and they had a number of glass panes in them. Now, anyone who wanted to just put this giant rock of chalk through the glass could have done so very easily. But they didn't, did they? They were rattling on the doors, and I remember my mother cradling us on the stairs, and all of us being absolutely terrified. And I remember it vividly, and it was a very scary experience. You know, it's the first introduction to me of the state's terror tactics, and we've been at war ever since, in truth. Since I was 4 years old, I'm 56 now, nearly 57, I've been at war with this evil, corrupt regime. And I don't intend to stop being at war with it either. Okay? Trust that is unequivocally clear, and this is one of the reasons why I won't be stopping that war against this evil regime until it is totally destroyed. And I remember it vividly. Yeah, my mother scared witless and cradling us in her arms on the stairs, and my oldest brother rushing around upstairs looking for a weapon with which to defend us, and he would have done as well, you know, without a doubt. He was 6 years older than me, and but you know, even he was still a young boy himself, you know, but he would have defended us, you know. I've absolutely no doubt about that. And then there was a great big crash at the top of the doors, and all the doors shattered and shuddered, and the glass as well. Didn't break the glass, and then it stopped. And my father, in actual fact, was on a night shift at Moor Green Colliery, which was about 1.25 miles away. And I explained that incident to him, and all the prowling incidents as well. You know, no one was ever caught for prowling, and it went on for a very long time, but no one was ever caught for that prowling. And they were always seen on the back garden. We had a long, large back garden, and deep grass at one time, because my father couldn't maintain it because of the shift pattern he was involved in, and we were always at school until the school holidays, when we would be given the task to maintain it. But yeah, I remember all of that vividly. And that particular night, when my father came home from work the next morning at 6 a.m, I mean, I hasten to add that had my father been there, whoever was doing that would have been disincentivized in the most brutal manner possible, because that's the type of man my father was. Absolutely right as well, protecting his family. And so yes, there was this big piece of chalk, and there was a dint in the door, in the wooden doors, where it had been thrown. Now, as I said, there were 8 panels of glass in each door. Could have put it straight through the door quite easily to try and get in, but that wasn't the objective, was it? It was harassment, intimidation, terror tactics. And I remember that night very vividly. And as I said, I remember all the prowling incidents as well. No one ever caught for them. despite endless calls to the police about this prowling, no one was ever caught. And apparently the rumour was in the local community that this prowler was operating at over a dozen properties. And eventually someone was stopped in the local area, and that was the last we ever heard of it. No action taken at all. And so that's what I grew up with. And in 1984 I was still at school, coming up to my last year at school. And I grew up in the midst of a huge amount of politicization, mainly leftism. And my father obviously was a leftist, he was a communist, quite frankly, and as I've explained before, and the whole town was in the grip of this strike, and Moor Green Colliery obviously was devastated by the strike, even though it had another 30 years worth of coal in it. Maggie Thatcher decided to destroy the mining industry completely, to eradicate the NUM, and what she actually did was devastate one community after the other all over the country. In fact, every community that she targeted here in Nottinghamshire, as a result, those areas some years later, the houses there looked like Beirut, all boarded up, riddled with crime, drugs took over, and then firearms came into the equation, and Nottingham became known as Shottingham, with some of the biggest and most dangerous criminal underworld figures in the country. That's how Nottingham became what it did, and that was all because of Margaret Thatcher, not the milk snatcher, the coal snatcher. And what she did was deliberately divisive, and she divided the entire country, and bent police backed her up to the hill. And then I remember coming of age and being involved in the poll tax rebellion. I was actually in the British National Party at that time, and the BNP's official policy was to back the poll tax rebellion, and so I did, and I refused to pay the poll tax. And I remember being taken into a call. No police there at all. Actual fact is very odd in Nottingham, and no trial of any description, no hearing, no due process of any description. Yes, this is just how corrupt this country is. Okay, you talk about Keir Starmer last year. Yes, absolutely, he was incredibly heavy-handed, and we all knew he was going to be. But think back to the poll tax rebellion. That was heavy-handedness on steroids, and it was the left that was being targeted primarily, but I also got targeted. I was summoned into court, and Nottingham Magistrates Court as it was then, on Burton Street. They read out my name, 3 months suspended sentence. No, didn't even ask me a word, just my name, my date of birth, here's your sentence, next. I mean, in what way does that constitute justice of any description? And Thatcher got her comeuppance during the poll tax rebellion because she lost it, and that ultimately set about the process that brought her downfall. And ultimately is fitting, I guess, really, that the traitors in her own party, the Europhiles, the EU fanatics, actually got rid of her. Excuse me. And the politicisation between the police and the government ran amok, quite frankly. So in what way is it different now? I mean, I saw many instances in the British National Party where police officers were overtly favourable and friendly towards us, and some were just completely and utterly toxic. Anti-BNP, some of them were pro-BNP. And but where did it officially begin, this collusion between the far left and the police? Well, I remember it also very vividly, equally vividly, probably more vividly than the miners' strike, because I was on an anti-IRA demonstration with the British National Party in the West End of London in April 1993. In fact, if you look on my X timeline, you can see the magazine reports of it at that time and all the photos. And in fact, one of the photos is used for the profile of this video. And I was one of the flag bearers in that picture, just stood right at the very back, but which was actually in the centre. And that's actually related in my book, The Fanatics, The Rise and Fall of the British National Party, and the extent to which we were provoked. I mean, I was just stood there. I was one of 50 flag bearers I was doing nothing other than holding a flag, waiting for further instructions from John Tyndall and Richard Edmonds, who was stood very close to me. And a Met police officer, for want of a better description, bent copper. I do hope he wasn't a sex offender and taking bribes from News International, which was most likely, in actual fact, yeah, absolutely. Just came up and whacked me straight across the shoulder with a baton for absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing at all. I'd not said a thing, not even made eye contact with him. And I just lowered the flagpole, because bearing in mind these flags cost £50 each with the flagpole, and it was made of solid wood and brass with a brass spike on the top, and he was wearing body armour, and I just rammed it straight into his abdomen. But as that happened, the whole scene had kicked off. There was just a battle between the riot police and the BNP, provoked entirely by them and their criminal friends in the press. Because what had happened on the right flank was that the press had been deliberately ramming their large telephoto lenses into the faces of some of our guys who'd had enough of it, and picked them up and threw them over the railings into the basement flats. So obviously the bent coppers had to get stuck in, didn't they? It was all orchestrated, completely orchestrated. There was nothing organic about it, nothing planned on our part either. Nobody even mentioned a thing about it. Our only objective that day was to continue with the rally up to Speaker's Corner on Hyde Park, where John Tyndall was going to give a speech. And they stopped us on Edgware Road to ensure that we didn't get there. And Edgware Road then wasn't like it is now. It was quite different, although it was becoming the hellhole that it is now, that absolute dunghole. And anyone who knows Edgware Road will know exactly what I'm talking about. I've walked up and down that place more times than I've had hot dinners, quite frankly, and I've had quite a few of those in the past as well. I think so anyway. And yeah, absolutely, it just descended into a battle. And they brought up the mounted horse eventually, and there was a police helicopter, and they were bringing in reinforcements. And over on the right flank was about 600 far left, stood right behind the police. The police were, in essence, the shock troops, so they weren't very shocking. They were no use against us at all that day, quite frankly. We stopped them dead in their tracks. Truly, we did. Absolutely. You know, the BNP was a very serious organisation. You can never liken us to the National Front or these clowns in the centre right. They're just not in the same league, truly. And you know, we were into direct action, big time. Simple as that. And direct action was the name of the game the whole time I was in the BNP, in truth. And then John Tyndall ordered us to disperse, which we vehemently disagreed with, and it caused massive division in the party, real deep anger, even on the scene. But he'd been threatened with a public order offence and several years imprisonment by this vile, jumped-up chief superintendent, a little shit in actual fact, about 5'7". A good gust of wind could have blown him over, but there you go. That's the case with most of these senior coppers. And so Tyndall ordered us to disband, so we had to make our way back to our coaches. Now, the police outriders, it was all orchestrated, all arranged. The police liaised with Tyndall and other BNP leaders, and we were told that we would be given 2 police outriders who would escort us out onto Bayswater Road. And then so far as down to, I think it's down to the island where Shepherd's Bush, so we could then take a right turning and make our way up towards Wembley and back towards the M1. But that's not what happened, is it? At all, no. Because as soon as we turned right onto Bayswater Road, the police outriders literally pelted off at high speed, and about 600 to 650 Reds attacked the coach. They were just stood there waiting in ambush. And the North Yorkshire coach, which had gone to the left onto Oxford Street, got exactly the same ambush treatment. And another coach carrying activists from South London got ambushed at Battersea by design, all involving Red Action, AFA. They brought out their entire mob, and also the ANL, SWP, who weren't very brave souls at all in actual fact. And in truth, all I can say is that was a completely orchestrated operation between the bent coppers, Metropolitan Police, criminal scum, quite frankly, in my opinion, and that is the truth. And my dealings with them, they're absolutely disgusting people, absolutely disgusting. And I think I've enumerated all the reasons why I feel that. and quite rightly and justifiably so. Go and seek a criminal behaviour order. Who cares? You won't silence me, and I won't comply with it. Let it sink in. You know, your instruments of tyranny will not stop me. Okay, I will continue to speak and expose the truth in defence of our freedom of expression, and to ensure that the truth is known in a nation that is basically being subjected to terror tactics on a massive scale by the foreign occupation government and its bent coppers. For now, that is. That will be coming to an end within the next 18 months. Guaranteed. Okay? But yes, Epping. Epping wasn't the beginning of the collusion between bent coppers brainwashed by commie purpose or common purpose Marxism today. On the contrary, no, that's just a continuation of the chain of collusion between the far left and the police. And they've always taken a very favourable view towards them since April 1993. And I saw it all over the country after that in April 1993, how the police changed towards us and how the left were always a tandem act, screaming their abuse and spouting their lies while it stood behind bent coppers for protection. Because when they came to attack us with no bent coppers around, they got filled in 90% of the time. And of course they didn't like being filled in, did they? They wanted to do the filling in, and they got filled in instead. And so that's why this policy began. And the police obviously knew that the left, their far left shock troops, were getting filled in all over the country, and so they had to protect them, and that's exactly what they did. And what you saw at Epping was absolutely, in essence, the work of an agent provocateur organisation, Essex Police, working cap in glove, a tandem act with the far left, stand up to racism and Antifa. Although one thing I would say is, you know, don't let Nick Tanconi anywhere near them, will you? Because the moment he's told to go home, like he was in France, he does run it, because he's a coward. He loves winding it up. He loves talking it up and acting the hard man. But, you know, there's a big difference between lifting weights in the gym and actually doing the business at the business end. You know, and Tanconi's never been in a real street battle, and he'd run a million miles from if he actually ever saw one. And so, yes, in Epping, there's been no riot in Epping. I've seen riots, okay? I've seen direct action, street battles, loads of them. And I can assure you there has been no riot at Epping of any description. And so when people talk about an Epping riot, it's just fantasy, absolute nonsense. And in closing, the drivel on GB News today effectively blaming the Homeland Party, which has actually drifted off course into the centre right, and that much is obviously without contest as far as I'm concerned. Blaming the Homeland Party for the trouble in Epping is just pure dishonesty. The Homeland Party is not responsible for any of the trouble in Epping. In fact, there was no trouble in Epping until the bent coppers decided to run someone over, and then obviously the next day Ginger Tony came on, the hired gobshite, who's a state hireling in my opinion, never gets nicked despite her knuckle duster, always snorting cocaine off her head and causing trouble and provoking and inciting the left. Yeah, absolutely. You know, there was no trouble until they turned up, and there's been no real trouble since either, has there? In fact, the Homeland Party, as far as I'm concerned, particularly through Callum Barker, has done everything it possibly could to maintain law and order and peacefulness. In fact, they've done far more to maintain law and order than the bent coppers. That much is for certain. So don't be surprised by the antics of GB News today. And one thing I would say to Homelanders is, do you not realise the extent of the mistake you've made climbing into bed with Restore Britain? You know, your so-called beloved Charlie Downs, who's on GB News, yeah, and you're in league with him in Restore Britain, and this is how you get treated. You know, one day maybe you'll wake up and understand that what I'm trying to tell you is for your own good. And so, yes, collusion between the far left and the police. The police are the far left, aren't they? As far as I'm concerned, totally and utterly brainwashed at the highest level, and that filters down to the lowest levels. And if the lower ranks in the police don't like it, I know some of them don't, leave, quit, get another job, join the rebellion.